Thank you for staying with us. Time now for the news review on the AM show. And we're joined by convener National Interest Movement, Dr. Abu Sakara Foster, who is our guest one more time. Dr. Foster, a very good morning to you. Thank you for making the time to be with us this Thursday morning.
Good morning. And how are you this morning?
I'm okay. God day we day. Let me throw that back at you. How are you faring?
Well, I'm well. Thank you very much, by God's grace. Yes.
Great. So let's get into the papers. But maybe before we do, I'd like to run by you some topical matters that we've been discussing. Yesterday, I had KKD, Kwesiche Dakwa, here in the studio with me. And he was talking about the Council of State, for example, how it has outlived its relevance, how it should be scrapped. And in fact, that's on the back of the Agbogbomefia. Togbi Afede, the 14th, and what he says that Agbogbomefia of Asogli, I should add that, and what he says about returning the over 300,000 he did of his ex gratia. What do you make of that? Sound call?
Well, I think you will remember the last time we had an interview that on one of the issues regarding the checks and balances on the arms of state, that was one of the suggestions that we made. But we have one of two options. Either you restructure it as a second chamber and have its membership constituted in such a way that they're not beholden to the president and therefore can be a better checks and a balance on him, or you eliminate it altogether. But I think that improving on it and having a second chamber is a good way to go, particularly as we're also thinking of ways of introducing the influence of traditional rulers into it as another way of strengthening accountability.
And so for you, it should be scrapped.
Well, if you cannot enhance it and restructure it as a second chamber, certainly don't have it in its current form.
So unless it's a second chamber, but what kind of role will that second chamber play?
Well,
because we don't have a bicameral system. So you're opting for a bicameral system.
Yes, and this is basically one of the suggestions we were making along the constitutional review and then the amendments that should be made. And we suggested that we should look at making it a second chamber and have it with the leadership of it being elected along stakeholder institutions, so that you cannot have a one-sided affair in it all the time, and there will be cross-country representation in that chamber. It's not just a matter of the president selecting people. Most of the people will be elected in it. So if you have it that way, then it can act as a second check system. But if it is a question of most of the people being predominantly appointed by the president, even in the current form where you talk about regional elections, it's really amongst people that are from the president's political party or beholden onto him.
Two other things he says very quickly that I want to run by you, especially as you're in the position you occupy. I want you to share your thoughts on this. One, he says for speaking truth to power, he is being threatened. He's getting all kinds of calls that he could very well die, that there is that threat. But he's spoken to his father, and his father says even if that were to happen, he should go ahead speaking the truth. The other bit has to do with former President John Dramani Mahama. He says, on the back of all the happenings today, it was unfair for Ghanaians to do to the former president what we did in terms of hounding him out, saying he was incompetent and all of that. How do these two thoughts resonate with you? The first one anchoring on whether there is that culture of silence, and the second one about whether indeed, on the back of the MPP's performance, they have made the former president a saint, so to speak.
Well, I think the first thing is that, we all live in this country, and we are all aware of the fact that there needs to be respect for the rule of law. The struggles of the Fourth Republic have been predominantly about having the rule of law prevail and having freedom of speech. And I would defend that to the last minute. And certainly I have not, been seen to be partial one way or the other, because many times I do make critical comments, both of John Dramani Mahama's government and also of Nana Addo's government. But I've also been known to be somebody who supports some of the issues that they raise. So I think that it's a matter of style and making sure that, people understand you have no other agenda than the agenda of the national interest, and making sure that, you always make your points in such a way that they're constructive criticism that can be taken, even though sometimes people don't like it. I mean, it's normal in this society to not be popular because you have made criticism. That's not new.
Okay. And the other aspect on the former president, do you feel on the back of the performance of the MPP, in a way, the former president has been vindicated?
Well, I think a lot of people are comparing really the economic hardships that we have now, compared to the economic hardships we had during his tenure. And it is clear that, the economic hardships we have now are severe compared to the economic hardships we had under his period. However, having said that, I think let us examine this trend. Ghanaians always find that the government that comes after they've complained about the previous government always brings harder economic conditions than before. During Mahama's time, people complained because they thought, during Kufuor's time, things were a lot better. During Kufuor's time, people complained because they said during Rawlings' time, things were better. So what this says is that there is a deep underlying trend, a flaw in the country's economy, where it's sliding negatively to the point where we are just reduced to maintaining government. And that is a dangerous thing, because it means that our deepening debt as a nation, limits what we can do to alleviate pressures on people. That trend did not start with John Dramani Mahama. It started a long time ago. And IEA has done a very nice job of plotting this data for us so that it is unequivocal, because the debt profile gets deeper and deeper and deeper. There's never a time in which it goes back. The only time in which it went back was during Kufuor's time, when we were being forgiven some of our debts. But since then, it's been one trend downwards. Now, under those conditions, it is very difficult, if you are not generating more income than you are spending, to create better conditions for people. And then you're forced to face the reality, as we are now. I think the problem is when people give a false sense of how good things are going to be, and then we fall into the trap of believing that, things are going to be so good, the suffering is going to end, but that trend keeps going down, and then you're faced with a new reality, particularly when it is temporarily alleviated by borrowing huge sums of money, which are not put into the growth areas of the economy so that they can actually alleviate the problem. So we are where we are now, and the real issue is, what are we going to do about it?
What are we going to
do? Are we going to stop and take a deep look at ourselves and say, yes, now we need to make a fundamental change? And if we're going to make that fundamental change, we should use this going to IMF for the 17th time as the opportunity to do that. Let's not just go there to get enough money to maintain our interest payments on loans, and then, meet government wages, and then survive for a time. And then again, things get very bad, and then we go back there again. That is the trend. So this time, let's say, look, we have to grow the box that generates our income so that there is a surplus beyond what we need to run the state. And the things that we need to do that mean a restructuring of our economy. And we must do that. We know where we need to do it. We need to do it in agriculture and manufacturing.
Let's stay on the bit of the economy as we get into the Daily Graphic newspaper, Doc. A decision on IMF can't be blamed on government. President Akufo-Addo says so. There's also a Graphic LOC partner to deliver world-class African games and make prompt payment of royalties to mining communities. That's the Chamber of Mines CEO. On the back page, 3 hygiene schools receive lab and office equipment, and UG 2010 medical school class hands over water system to BQ hostel. But let me quickly take a look at that story on the economy. It says the decision to seek an International Monetary Fund supported program cannot be blamed on the government, President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo has said. He said while a section of the public blamed the government for mismanaging the economy, the situation was way beyond the making of the government, as it was occasioned by current global crises, which had not spared other economies around the world. Quoting him, he says, in fact, the big difference that we're having in Ghana today and why we have gone back to the IMF is that everybody recognizes it is not as a result of my mismanagement, as was the case during the tenure of the previous government. I want to hold right there and put some pointed questions to you. We know that currently, Dr. Foster, inflation has hit levels that we've not seen in some 20 plus years, since 2003 December. We know that the cedi's depreciation has affected our currency to the point where it's the second worst performing currency in the world, only second to the Sri Lankan rupee. And we see what has happened in Sri Lanka. We know that interest rates are soaring. Of course, the monetary policy, as the central bank has hinted, might go up even further. When the president says, my administration is not to blame, is he right? And again, the comparison that is often made between Mahama's economy and Akufo-Addo's economy, which one for you is better?
Well, I think the first thing is to respond to the president's statement that the decision cannot be blamed on government. Well, it may be the case that that decision cannot be blamed on government, but the politics around it and the atmosphere created around it is solely government's responsibility, because it was them that made an issue about going to the IMF and made it a political issue by saying they would never go to the IMF and making it seem as if going to the IMF was a bad thing. So once you put that out there in the public domain and people buy into it, that you're good and your things are good because you're not going to the IMF, then when the opposite happens, they're going to ask you, so what happened? So I think that we have to be fair and look at this in the context of the atmosphere that the government itself created around the issue of the IMF. Now, if things were sliding, and things started sliding long before the issue on Ukraine, and as I explained to you, we've always had this deep-seated issue of how we correct the structure of the economy so that we can control our expenditure and increase our revenue and stop, this business of always borrowing money just to maintain and keep our heads above water. So if that was the case, and the president spoke to it in his inaugural address and his address to the nation of the state, when he said categorically that the issues are structural and we must deal with them. The question then is, if they're structural, what were the measures taken to correct the structure?
Right.
So if those measures had been taken at that time, perhaps we wouldn't be going to the IMF so readily. And there's nothing wrong going to the IMF if our going to the IMF was indeed to correct the structural flaws in the economy. And that, for me, is the issue. We should have been outright bold enough to say, look, this trend has continued for a period before up to my administration. We thought we could slow it down with, interventions here and there, but we need to make a bigger intervention than that. It's a structural problem, and because of that, we're proposing A, B, C, D, so that we're going to correct the situation where our revenue is less than our expenditure. And these are the measures we're going to take in our revenue box. These are the measures we're going to take in our expenditure box. For example, if public sector wages, the public sector wage bill has increased because the numbers of people on the public sector wage have gone from 600,000 during Mahama's time to over 800,000 now. That's 300,000 more people. So as you are going to IMF, by how much are you going to cut this? If the number of people employed in Jubilee House have increased up to 1,000 people, by how much are you going to cut this? And this question is not just for the government, it's also for any government that may come in after the government, because that condition will be the same. And therefore, you have to propose. It's not enough just to say, well, there's over expenditure, profligate expenditure, the government has done this, done that, yes. But if you want to come into power, by how much are you going to cut this? This is the solution Ghanaians need to know, so that we don't just change administrations and remain with the same problem.
Right.
And therefore, we would address the issue of which you mentioned earlier. Well, has this administration made Mahama look like an angel? The issue is the problems that were there in Mahama's administration, the fundamental problems of our expenditure exceeding our revenue. They were not cured during his time, and they were not cured this time. But maybe they may have been worsened because of the excessive borrowing, but the problem is still there. So if we are going to have a change, the real issue is, well, that problem will be addressed. And if it is not going to be addressed, then there's no point in going there. If it is going to be addressed, then we should know specifically how it is going to be addressed in these two boxes.
Right.
Expenditure, revenue.
Interesting take there. Let's do one international story and take it from there with the Ghanaian Times newspaper. But I stay with the Daily Graphic. So, U.S. to return $23 million Abacha loot. And this has been trending recently. The U.S. has agreed to return another installment of $23 million to Nigeria, which is part of money allegedly looted and stashed abroad by former Nigerian military ruler Sani Abacha. Justice Minister Abubakar Malami signed on behalf of Nigeria, while the U.S. ambassador in Nigeria, Mary Leonard, signed on behalf of the U.S. So interesting details. The money, according to Mr. Malami, will be hitting the accounts of Nigeria soon. And the U.S. in 2020 returned more than $300 million to Nigeria. I followed the discussion on Facebook, and some were asking about our Ghanaian politicians and that the U.S. should check them out as well if they have any stashed loot out there. And some were also insinuating, some Nigerians were saying that, no, you know what, hold on to the money because it will be re-looted when it's brought back into the system. Though the Nigerian government has said it would use it for infrastructural purposes. But these returns from time to time that we have heard, a pittance really compared to what lies in the accounts of countries like Switzerland, the Swiss banks, the American banks, among others. What's your take on it?
Well, as you said, it's the tip of the iceberg compared to what should actually come back. So if it is being used as some kind of assagement, then it's not acceptable, even though it is a good thing. What about the rest? But a step in the right direction.
Right.
What we should be now looking at is where's the rest and how can we get it? But beyond that, we should say, well, if this money comes, it should be put in a special fund. Let's call it the looted fund, okay? Mm-hmm. And then we use that for designated long-term strategic interventions that are outside of our normal recurrent budget. And that way, we don't need to go and borrow money to be able to do those projects. For example, in our case, we could use it for our railway system. We could use it for our waterway system. And we do those things that are not politically driven. I would not put it into roads immediately because the way of constructing roads is very much driven by our politics, where, you know, if you're a powerful politician, you can get a road to your place. But other people somewhere else may not get that road, right, even though that road may be leading to centers of production, which may be more productive than where the other road is going. So that is not where I would put the money immediately, apart from the main trunk roads. That's to say, Tamale all the way to Bolga, or, you know, along the coast those strategic roads which serve everybody, and then do the railway system and do the waterway system.
Right.
Those are the things that we could use that fund for. And in that case, then the money doesn't even need to come here. From where it is in America, hold it on account there and know that your looted fund is this much. So whenever you need a project, let's have a look at the project. Let's have a look at the contract. Make sure that everything is, up to par.
Right.
You're not using contractors who have overbloated the project. You're using competent contractors, and that the time frame is right. Then they give you that. If you do a good job, when you come back, they give you some more. If you don't do a good job, you don't get any more of it.
Right. Let's get into the Ghanaian Times newspaper. GRA tax clearance certificate goes electronic effective October. There's also 6,498 kilometers of roads awarded on contracts in Ashanti region. That's according to Simon Osei-Mensah, the regional minister. Heavy rains cut off communities in West District, and police gunned down 3 suspected robbers. I'll do the story on the heavy rains, the GRA tax, and I'll try to link that to something else. But on page 16, let's start from there. The Ghana Revenue Authority will, from October this year, issue tax clearance certificates electronically to taxpayers, Vice President Alhaji Dr. Baumia has announced. A tax clearance certificate is documentary evidence issued to confirm that the taxpayer is up to date with any tax payments and has met all applicable tax obligations at the date of issue. That's the first story. There's also the bit about heavy rains cutting off communities in the West District. That story on page 13 of the newspaper. And it says a 12-hour downpour Monday evening and Tuesday morning has cut off some communities in the West District of the Upper West region from the district's capital, Wishiao, and the regional capital, Wa. The rain washed away some feeder roads and submerged small bridges constructed over culverts to link major communities after creating floods in the middle of the road. The president, of course, was recently, right before he went into the Savannah region, he was in the Upper West region and, on his national tour. And it's interesting that these have happened in the last few days. For me, looking at the situation up north, it's even more pathetic when it comes to flooding. But what are your quick reflections on these two matters? The tax clearance certificate going electronic and flooding in Wishiao and Wa.
I think the tax clearance certificate going electronic is a good thing, provided, of course, that it works flawlessly. If you do this and then the system doesn't work, you create a lot of problems for people.
Right.
So I would say that the transition part of it should be handled in such a way that both the manual and the electronic are available for a period, so that if you're having problems with the electronic one, you can then go to the manual. But or when you arrive there, even for the manual, they will assist you try and do the electronic one before they do it manually if there's a real problem. So I think the transition really is the issue. It's always a good thing when things are made simpler and more accessible to everybody. So that's a good thing. The second thing on the floods, I would say that this is not the first time or the second or the 10th, as a matter of fact. We've always had issues with this flooding. And the reason is that the channels contain less water, or can contain less water than is available at a given period of time. And we know when that excess water usually occurs, if you look at the flow patterns or the occurrence of these floods. So we can get a clear estimate of the total quantum of water that can be held in those channels without flood occurring. And by calculating this, we can do the dams off the main channels so that we hold this excess water which causes the flooding.
Right.
And that's basically what I mean by investment in key infrastructure, waterway systems that will control the flooding, provide areas for irrigation, and provide motorable transport along the waterway systems, which is the cheapest form of transport, and alleviate the burden on our roads.
Right.
This plan has been on the drawing board since the First Republic. Can you believe it or not? Ada, there was a port supposed to be at Ada with locks at Kong and Akosombo, which means that straight from the sea, from that port, barges can be lifted. A lock is a lift system for boats. So when it gets to the dam at Kong, it can be lifted up to the next water. And then when it gets to Akosombo, it's lifted up. And you go all the way to Bipe, which is an inland port. And that would serve the entire inland areas, including Burkina, etc. All the business for Burkina and Niger would come here. So if we do these waterway systems, the floods the water that is causing the floods would actually be a bonus to us instead of being a negative. So we need to invest in these things. And they're not things that you can do a little bit here now, and then maybe next week you do another little bit, and the year after that you do another little bit. Because when the water comes, it's very powerful. It will erode all the things you've done if it is not sufficient to hold the water. So this is just something we need to address once and for all.
Once and for all. Thank you, Doc. Another story there, 14 grabbed for premixed fuel diversion, illegal sand winning. Story on page 3. You can grab a copy of the Ghanaian Times newspaper and get the details. The Daily Guide newspaper now. US-based Ghanaian convicted for romance scam. Story on page 6. There's also NDC stages political coup, in quotation marks, in Ashanti. Of course, there's been talk about Asiedu Nketia, the General Secretary, gunning for the chairmanship position of Samuel Ofosu-Ampofo. And I've heard Ofosu-Ampofo speak in recent times about the fact that he is ever prepared for any challenger, but whether Johnson Asiedu Nketia will actually go for that position is another matter altogether. I have two interesting stories here that I find curious, but anyway, headlines. Attempt to nail customs boss in tax evasion backfires. Story on page 3 of the Daily Guide newspaper. And then government removes incentives for corruption. That's also on page 3. Would that we actually did that. Let's also get into the business finder. Museums and castles will lead tourism in the next 5 years. Executive Director pledges. COP Tiwa did not comment on Namwan's prosecution. That's according to the APC. And issuance of tax clearance certificate to be automated soon, as I made mention of. But right before we go, Doc, I'd like you to just give me some information. I know in recent times a 13-member constitutional review committee was set up, of which you are a member, and it was the Parliamentary Affairs Minister, Oseche Mensah-Bonsu, was there. He was on hand to actually do this. We had the 2010 Constitutional Review Commission. Now we're having this. What has changed? What made you agree to be a party to this? And maybe would you, on the back of the earlier discussion we're having about Council of State, would you opt for the scrapping of Article 71 so that all this business of ex gratia and others will go?
I think the first thing is to look at the process of the constitutional review that is going on. This is a committee that has been commissioned by the leader of the majority, Honorable Chebun Mensah. And
so you're looking into the work of the 2010 committee?
Well, no. Of course, it's a comprehensive review, which will look not only at the work commissioned by President Atta Mills, the constitutional review document that was commissioned, but also subsequently all the inputs that have been made by various CSOs over that 10-year gap.
Right.
Because things have changed and other experiences have come. So that is the breadth of the scope of the review. However, the process for it is what we are talking about. To be honest with you, I'm not a member of any committee because I've not been asked to be a member of any committee. We simply were invited to a meeting that would look at this, and we're asked to give our inputs. So we did. This is the first time I've heard about a committee being put up. Again, we're a bit surprised because we thought that it would be something that would be inaugurated by the Speaker of Parliament rather than the executive, which is basically what the Minister of Justice is part of the executive.
Right.
So we thought that it would be led by Parliament rather than being led by the executive. So in that way, we're getting a little bit confused because if it was a parliamentary committee, then the outputs of it would automatically feed into the parliamentary process.
Right.
If it is from the Minister of Justice's office, yes, they can make their recommendations, but the president still has the opportunity to say, well, don't submit this on my behalf. I don't like it.
Right.
So that's why we approached the Speaker of Parliament with a petition for a review, so that it will be an integral part of the parliamentary process. And thereafter, whatever the output was, the actions that would follow would automatically, be in Parliament where it belongs.
Okay.
Now, having said that, half a loaf is better than nothing. So we want to see how this process goes and see how to broaden the scope of the committee or the membership of the committee to make sure that there are balanced voices. I, for one, would like to see people like Professor Atugba and Professor Bafu Ajimandra in it. We don't want to see only voices of compliance. We'd like to see voices that are critical as well, because the way you do the review is also very important on the outcome. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sakara, for joining us this morning for the news review. Always refreshing. We wish you a good day, sir.
Much.
And that is Dr. Abu Sakara, convener National Interest Movement. He has been our guest. Right before we go, I met this lovely 9-year-old today, right in our premises. She's 9 years today, and her name is Angel Nana Ajwa Bima. Angel, happy birthday to you. God bless you on your journey. On that note, we settle for sports up next on the AM show. Stay.